Good morning, everyone. We'll give everyone a chance to stream into our meeting. I'm Jeff Robbins, Chair of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. This is the Commission's weekly meeting. It's February 10th. It's 10 a.m. and we're allowing folks to stream in. Let's let that continue until it starts to taper off, and then we'll do the roll call. Okay, looks like we've tapered off with about 57 participants. Thank you all for joining us. Hearings Manager Thomas, if you could do the roll call, that would be great.
Certainly. Commissioner Vogt?
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
Here.
Commissioner Hackett?
Here.
Commissioner McGowan?
Here.
Commissioner Messner?
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Here.
And Chair Robbins?
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Great, good to see everybody. Welcome again to a Zoom meeting of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We have on our agenda today 3 items: general public comment, followed by a presentation from staff on sort of current state around financial assurances, to then tee off our moving into a rulemaking around that topic, and then commissioner comments. So we'll start with general public comment. I've got a list of 9 people who signed up by the deadline, which was noon yesterday. And the first person on my list is Christine Nyholm. Thank you, Hearings Manager Thomas, for bringing Ms. Nyholm to the panel. Ms. Nyholm, we can see that you're with us. Are you able to testify at this point?
Yes, I am.
Great. As is normal the case, everyone will have 3 minutes, and we look forward to hearing from you. So you're on.
Okay, thank you, commissioners. And thank you for your recent rulemakings. Your aim to protect public health and safety is admirable. Unfortunately, as a member of the public, I am here this morning to tell you that the public is not being heard. I have closely followed the development of Great Western's Ivy site because it is in the rapidly growing urban quarter that has been my home for 35 years. On at least 2 occasions, the public surrounding Ivy submitted hundreds of comments expressing great concern and fears regarding our health and safety, and asked that both the location and drilling permits be denied. That itself is nothing short of miraculous, because we all know that access to the how, where, when of submitting public comment is ridiculously complex. But the public did, and they were ignored. The COGCC did listen to Great Western. They convinced you that they could alleviate the public's concern by building a higher sound wall. They would use a less odorous drilling mud. They would hold community meetings. I attended several of those meetings. Early in the process, a couple of neighborhood moms tried to ask questions. They were told they could not. When they persisted, the presenter motioned for the police to move in. After that, using Great Western's term, they presented science fairs. Several residents told me that Great Western talked down to them, so they stopped attending. But the most important protection requested by the public, Great Western could not give them. I listened to your lengthy discussion on the necessity of a 2,000-foot setback to protect the public. Those living just 1,300 feet from Ivy depended on you to give them this vital protection, and you ignored them. And now I realize that the dangers of Ivy goes far beyond the pad. Older existing wells in the wake of Ivy's 3-mile horizontals will continue to compromise public health and safety. Great Western informed the public north of Ivy in the Orchard Farm neighborhood that their only park will be torn up to work on an older well. As one resident stated during COVID, this is the only place our teenagers can hang out. They play basketball there for hours, now it's gone. South of Ivy, we have endured 4 workover operations on wells that are just 500 feet from the home with special needs children, who become extremely agitated by the continuous loud clanging noises of the workover rig and by the thick clouds of diesel fuel they spew into the air. These concerns fell on deaf ears. The following quotes from next door indicate that you are not listening to the public. Has anyone in Quill Valley or surrounding areas been hearing loud, unknowing noises outside tonight? I don't even know how to explain. Just loud, whiny, machine-like sounds. I just called non-emergency Thornton PD. They are going to send cars up to the site. It's just so loud. I feel for all the people who have to be up early Monday morning. So probably the new structure by 470 then. Finally, someone did call COGCC. I got a call from the state, Randy. He said they are drilling 18 lines at once. That's why there's 2 rigs. Once they start, it's nonstop, 24/7 for 3 weeks. In conclusion, you dialogued with Great Western and you trusted them to take care of the public's concerns. You did not dialogue with the public and thus failed those living closest to Ivy. Until you do, the Ivy permit should be rescinded. Then once you put into place regulations that require actual communication with the public that you are mandated to protect, you can reevaluate their permits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nyholm, for the comments. Next on our list is Kate Christensen.
Hello.
Hello, Ms. Christensen. We can hear you.
Okay. Good morning. I'd like to thank the Commission for their time and attention this morning. I'm a speech language pathologist. I'm a mom of a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I'm with 350 Colorado. I haven't been able to participate with the COGCC as much as I would have liked in the past year. As I'm sure the Commission knows, the past year has been brutal for working moms. But just because I haven't been able to participate and show up doesn't mean that I think things are going well. I live at the northeasternmost edge of Lafayette, Colorado. It's just spitting distance from Erie. So what happens in Erie's air directly impacts my family. Just in the past few weeks, Erie has gotten dozens of liquid unloading notices from multiple operators, multiple sites. Rule 903D1E says that liquid unloading can include venting, flaring, swabbing. This flood of action is problematic for several reasons. First, we already have an F- grade air quality according to the American Lung Association. I'm worried about my family's health. It seems like the COGCC should have addressed cumulative impacts, and the COGCC gets 48 hours notice in advance of any of these actions, but there doesn't seem to be a mechanism for the cumulative impacts in one community of all this activity. We're supposed to have continuous air monitoring according to SB 181 and Erie's own regulations, but that's not happening. So we have no idea how many toxins are being spewed into the air around Erie right now. There's no way to tell. The other point that this flurry of activity and notices brings to mind is just how many wells are in this community already. All of them will eventually need to be cleaned up. And I know we're addressing hopefully the 700 series soon, but it costs $270,000 on average to clean and cap an orphan and abandoned well, and our state has 80,000 wells. The oil and gas industry is on the verge of financial collapse, and if we don't do something serious and soon, our state will be on the hook for billions of dollars. My request for the Commission is just stop activity, stop permitting, no more oil and gas, no more new wells until we can address the problems like local cumulative impacts, notifying the public in meaningful ways, and continuous air monitoring and making sure that our future is financially solvent. Until we can meaningfully address public health and safety and financial concerns, we just need to stop moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Christensen, for participating with us and taking time out of your day to provide us your comments. We now have Heidi Leithwood.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, thank you for taking our comments today. I also have a resource list that backs up the facts that I'm citing in my testimony. Should I send that to you by email or?
Yes, if you want to email that to us, we'd be happy to receive it.
Okay, thank you. I'm here as a member of 350 Colorado and Collective for Another World. SB 181 mandates that you fulfill responsibilities to health, safety, and the environment. My concern is that you are fulfilling these responsibilities minimally, if at all. I ask that you do the maximum to fulfill your moral responsibilities. Take bold action for our health, safety, and the environment with the legal backing of SB 181. We must stop drilling new wells. Burning the amount of fossil fuels currently in development would result in exceeding many times over the maximum safe rise in global warming. Colorado is not fulfilling its agreements passed by law in HB 19-1261 to reduce GHG emissions. Your decisions will either move us forward or backward in meeting Colorado's GHG targets. The 2021 report by 350 Colorado shows that we are not on target and recommends that we reduce permits 10% annually. The right to a clean and livable environment is a basic moral human right. This right is now recognized in constitutional law of over half the countries in the world. The UN is considering enacting it internationally. The UN also recognizes that this right to a livable environment is being violated by climate change. New research shows that fracking bears a much larger part of the blame than previously known. 2 new studies show that the rise in methane is, quote, massive, and, quote, shale gas is a major player. Fracking is also linked to many human health hazards and the pollution of water, air, and ecosystems. So it violates the moral human right to a clean environment in Colorado and also regionally and globally and to future generations. BIPOC communities are affected disproportionately by climate change and pollution. And currently the risks of COVID are multiplied by air pollution. Colorado should implement a moratorium on fracking during COVID. At the very least, we should implement continuous monitoring of wells so frontline communities can know the levels of toxic emissions to which their families are being exposed. Colorado studies show that there are health risks at 2,000 feet, so we should do additional studies for effects beyond 2,000 feet. And we should also learn from research that has already been conducted. I have on my resource list a compendium of 800 pages of scientific, medical, and media evidence on the harms of fracking. I urge this commission to consider their ethical duty to make decisions that will help slow global warming and end the pollution caused by the production and burning of shale gas. As a private citizen, I urge you to consider your moral duties and end new permits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Leithwood. And if you could email the compendium to us, we'll look forward to receiving that. We now have Jan Rose.
Good morning, commissioners. Thank you for taking the time for public comment today. I'm going to try to organize my comments into 2 distinct areas. One is my disappointment with the current state of public notice and standing. I am speaking on behalf of myself as a layperson, but having been involved, as all of you were, in 13 solid weeks of mission change rulemaking, I now understand the process a lot better than I used to. And I understand that the commission is doing its best to get timely information in the form of weekly docket information and applications out to the public. But the method of using that information is still quite frustrating. And it's my hope, after talking with a number of other people who were parties to mission change, that we can put together a group of public stakeholders that can provide advice to COGCC staff on ways to improve communications of the status of permits and applications at the COGCC. I think you heard last week that searching the site for this information is extraordinarily frustrating and discouraging. And I think it'll be fairly easy to improve that process. And I would love to work with the commission on making that more user-friendly, particularly since it's now your mission to regulate and therefore presumably to inform the public in a more fulsome and easy manner than when you fostered oil and gas development. So I throw that out there, and I will follow up with Ms. Larson or Ms. Amaro and see if we can put something together that benefits us all. And now I'd like to turn my attention to financial assurances. because having been involved in mission change, I now know enough to haunt my dreams about Form 9s and Form 10s and the transfer of operatorship. And it really does haunt me that we can actually, in bankruptcy proceedings, sell wells, but not sell the storage tanks and the frack water pits and the associated equipment that might live on a well pad along with those wells, and vice versa. The fact that we can transfer ownership in a sale or even in bankruptcy of only pieces of the infrastructure of a well pad is upsetting, because the implications are the public is going to have a lot of money in cleanup and remediation costs as the life of those products are implemented. And I also watch your enforcement dockets, and I'm aware of the number of enforcement actions for historical spills in places like storage tanks, and really get worried about whether we're leaving behind old metal storage tanks that are going to corrode and leak into the ground, and again, become the taxpayer's responsibility. And I know I'm out of time, but I guess to summarize, I really hope you'll do a financial assurances rulemaking that covers the cradle to grave costs of managing a well from the moment the pad gets cleared to the day that we finish reclamation of that well, and hold the industry responsible for covering those fees so they don't become the responsibility of Colorado citizens. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Rose, and would invite you to stick around after public comment. We're going to hear from staff about current state of financial assurances as our kickoff on that financial assurances rulemaking, and we look forward to your participation in that if you are able. So thank you for your comments today. We now will turn to Emily Baer.
Good morning, commissioners. Thank you for this time to speak with you. My name is Emily Baer. I'm a resident in Erie, Colorado. I'm here this morning because in the last 14 days, as Kate Christensen said earlier, our town has received dozens of notices, mostly of liquids unloading, happening at sites all around town. There are other activities happening as well. Some of them have noticed flaring and venting. By the industry's own admission, liquids unloading puts the public at risk because of emissions, spills, and leaks. This activity is happening at an alarming volume in Erie right now, compounding our exposure. We're certainly experiencing impacts in my house. I've emailed Erie's trustees and mayor and town administrator, as have a number of my neighbors, to share our concern and plead for intervention for our new Article 12 regulations that were architected from your own rulemakings to be triggered. The town seems to be scrambling to respond, very much on their heels, very much caught off guard from these notices. So I'm here today to implore you, the COGCC, to help us in Erie. Are you aware of the excessive liquids unloading that's happening in Erie? Has the COGCC signed off on it? Do you know that it's taking place at sites all over town, dotted through our neighborhoods within eyesight of our kitchen windows? Have you sent out the OGHIR team to monitor these activities in real time? Is someone watching results from any hopeful monitoring, shutting down activity when levels pose harm to residents? Has anyone from COGCC reached out to residents in Erie to check in, to educate us about adverse impacts we can experience and should watch out for? Have you as commissioners discussed the ethos of allowing such a high concentration of risky operations to take place all at once, compounding our exposure? Have you been in contact with Erie officials and with OGHIR representatives so you can work together to monitor this activity? Do you know why operators are performing this activity all at once, when it was my understanding from the rulemakings that liquids unloading would only be used in emergency situations and couldn't be noticed ahead of time? We need some support from this commission in Erie. We need more transparency, because while Form 2s and 2As are somewhat straightforward to find on your website, all of the other activities that are happening and put us at risk are not. And just as a person who, don't have an engineering degree, I'm not involved in the industry or with the COGCC in any capacity. I'm just a mom whose family has suffered impacts from living near fracking. And it's just really hard to navigate all of this and to even know what is it that's putting us at risk. So I just encourage you to plug into Erie right now and figure out ways to support us. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bear, for the comments. We now have next on our list, Dana Bovey.
I'm here.
We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioners, Front Range Eagle Studies submitted 2 complaints to the COGCC on November 24th, 2020 and January 21st, 2021, alleging that pumping operations providing water to Creststone's Dreamweaver pad in Weld County for the purposes of well stimulation adversely impact a critical winter roost for bald eagles located in high priority habitat. On February 3rd, the COGCC, through Mr. Duranlo, responded and agreed that the water pumping operations at issue adversely impact bald eagles. He noted that the operator and CPW concurred that these impacts were occurring due to pumps, workers, and noise in close proximity to the winter roost. However, Mr. Duranlo determined that water pumping operations for well stimulation were not oil and gas operations, and therefore COGCC could not regulate these activities. Mr. Duranlo construes that statutory and regulatory definitions of oil and gas operations, he construes those too narrowly. First, oil and gas operations are broadly defined as, for example, the exploration of oil and gas and related operations. Reading this definition to exclude well pumping operations for well stimulation is inconsistent with COGCC's obligation to regulate oil and gas activities, especially activities having direct adverse impacts on wildlife. Second, construing oil and gas operations to exclude water pumping for well stimulation is inconsistent with COGCC's regulation of other ancillary oil and gas activities, including, for example, flow lines, produced water, injection wells, reclamation activities, and regulation of off-site ancillary activities and conditions of approval. Third, construing oil and gas operations to exclude well pumping is inconsistent with a full reading of the Act and its implementing regulations. The policy structure dictates regulation and consideration of water pumping for well stimulation as part of the broader regulatory scheme to fulfill the directives of SB 181. 181 directs COGC to evaluate and address the potential cumulative impacts of oil and gas development. Mission change was designed to fulfill COGCC's obligation to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. If ancillary water operations are not included, cumulative impacts to terrestrial ecosystems cannot be measured or reported as required by the rules. The Commission should reconsider its overly narrow reading of the definition of oil and gas operations to ensure that its regulation of oil and gas activities is consistent with the letter and spirit of SB 181 and fulfills its clear mandate to regulate oil and gas in a manner that protects the environment. Thanks for the opportunity to provide comments today, and to the folks that looked over the complaints. We have readings on January 15th and 16th, dBA measurements for 1 hour that are 63 decibels, by the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you for bringing that information to us and giving us that perspective. We now have Susan Noble. Ms. Noble, we see you are a panelist. It looks like you're still muted.
Okay, I believe I'm unmuted now.
You are, we can hear you.
Thank you. I'm appearing before you again today, And I want to first say thank you so much for all of the time and effort that you're putting into learning more about the oil and gas activity in Colorado and the process. And I also really appreciate your sincerity. I have heard that many times when I have spoken here. I want to give you some dates. On January 6th, I first spoke to the COGCC, and I learned on that day that Extraction Oil and Gas, through the hearing officer, had misrepresented Commerce City's approval of its wells. That was in fact not true. On January 26th, I appeared before the COGCC commissioners, before you, to talk about the Edmonton site, which is located in unincorporated Adams County. There was a pooling application that was coming before the commissioners in, excuse me, in February. And I was told to come back in February when the pooling item came up. Imagine my surprise to learn that Edmonton was approved on January 11th. Edmonton was approved administratively. It was not on your agendas. It was not on the consent calendar. It was simply done by staff. On December 16th, there was an article in the Denver Post in which staff, originally it said Julie Murphy, but then it was changed to staff on the 17th, was telling operators to get their applications in as quickly as possible that they could miss the deadline, be in advance of the deadline of January 15th. So as I state, Edmonton was approved on January 11th, which was 4 days before the deadline. When I spoke to you, I pointed out that there are 3 sites that run in a straight line within a mile of each other, with Edmonton only 3/4 of a mile from the Outlook neighborhood of around 700 homes. That, I think, is a definition of cumulative impact. Nevertheless, it was approved. When 181 passed in 2019, the intent was there. The fact that the rules took longer than expected should not have anything to do with the intent of the legislature. Until it would allow anything less is very problematic. There are thousands of homes that have been approved. And that is a really big problem because these wells will be fracking under these thousands of homes. There were 5,000 wells in the pipeline. Adams County has approved 30 sites, as has the COGCC. That's almost all of E470 freeway. Not only Ivy, not only Edmonton, but Rio, Tower, Kestrel. A number of wells have been approved without the knowledge of any of us. On January 26th, you had a pooling training session. And during that, at the end of that training session, Commissioner Robbins asked Hearing Officer Peskin about protests from the public. And Mr. Peskin indicated that it was because of our education, that we were more educated about oil and gas, that we weren't speaking to the commissioners any longer. That is in fact not true. We have not been speaking because we thought that this was being taken care of. We thought that the new rules were going to be going into effect far sooner. Certainly COVID-19 has had an impact. Certainly being able to find information on the website is having an impact. So please, I really ask you to not do administrative review on these. They really need to be before the public so that we know that they are occurring and we can talk about them, and also to take into account cumulative impact. I'm really very discouraged that I made this effort in the last 6 weeks, and yet it was all for naught. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Noble, for being with us and testifying. We now have Ann Jordan.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Ms. Jordan.
Great. Thank you for hearing my comments. I'm here because of my grandchildren, as they have every right to live on a healthy planet when they grow up, and at the rate we're going, that won't happen. For so long, we have enjoyed the wealth oil and gas brings to our state without paying attention to the severe negative consequences and costs. As an example of those costs, I'm going to talk about Orphan Wells and make 4 points. 1, as you know, the amount of financial assurance money companies are required to pay is totally inadequate, and hopefully this will be addressed in the 700 rulemaking that is to come. From your own Orphan Well report of FY19, the state in FY19 paid 85% of the cost of cleanup of wells. Point 2, from your own FY19 and FY20 Orphan Well reports, at the rate we are cleaning up these sites, it will take 32 years to clean up just the existing reported sites in those reports. Obviously, this is way too slow. Number 3, toxins continue to be released into the air from Orphan Wells, and we do not even know the extent of this problem because we are not measuring it in any meaningful way. Point 4, explosions resulting from leaks at Orphan Well sites have left individuals dead and homes demolished. I cite the Firestone, Colorado event in 2017, Trinidad, Colorado in 2007, and La Plata County in 2005. In conclusion, I come back to my grandchildren and to yours. Is the short-term profit from oil and gas worth the long-term cost and loss to our finances in environment and health? Of course it isn't. Please stop oil and gas permits now and look at these consequences, and let's move forward in a more responsible way. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. Appreciate your providing the 4 points to us. We now have Janice Hollowell.
Now I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
We can
Hello?
hear you. Yes, hello.
You can hear me. Okay, great. Are you there?
Yes, we can hear you, Ms. Hollowell. Go ahead.
Hello?
Ms. Hollowell,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Wonderful. In 2010, yes, I can.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes. Good to go? Okay. In 2010, I moved to a farm in Boulder County with my husband and my daughter. In 2013, my daughter was diagnosed with chronic myelogenous leukemia, CML. We were told that it was caused by environmental factors. Back then, the oil and gas industry were saying that there was no scientific evidence that fracking was harmful, and local governments were being forced to believe it, or at least act like they believed it. We were told we needed fracking for clean energy and that it was a bridge to clean energy. Now we know differently. The American Lung Association, NASA, Cornell, and Harvard, plus many independent reports, have brought forth proof that fracking is speeding up climate change at an exponential rate and putting egregious amounts of pollutants into our air and water. Many say that it's no better than burning coal. If you factor in ozone, methane, and butane, it's far worse than coal. We haven't used fracking as a bridge to clean energy. It has been a way for oil and gas CEOs to make millions upon millions at the expense of the rest of us, our environment, and the health of our children. It turns out that fracking is not even an economically sustainable industry. Oil and gas companies are going broke at a very satisfying rate in spite of subsidies and all the looking the other way that cities, counties, the state, and commissions do. SB 19-181 passed, but we have yet to see compliance. HB 1261 passed, but no rules have been implemented to reduce permitting. We in the public haven't noticed detectable change in transparency or action from the COGCC. Add to all of this that Colorado is in severe drought. Last summer, we had 3 of our worst wildfires. Calwood fire came within 2 miles of my home, and we had to evacuate. The wildfires and drought, combined with fracking emissions, are making our air the worst it's ever been. It is time to chart a real path away from fracking, an industry that is failing anyway. I'm calling on the state of Colorado to stop bailing out the oil and gas industry and begin phasing in a plan to phase out oil and gas production 10% each year over the next 10 years, including demanding that oil and gas companies clean up their orphan wells and make sure that they do it. Because it's not just my daughter who's fighting cancer. We all are. Our land, our water, our air are contaminated with this bad industry. It only exists to make CEOs wealthy at the expense of the rest of us. It is your responsibility to rapidly phase out fracking before 2030. Thank you for hearing us today. Have a good day.
Thank you, Ms. Hollowell, for taking time out of your day to present to us. We appreciate the comments. The final public commenter this morning is Kate Merlin. So we bring Kate to the panel.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for letting me speak today. My name is Kate Merlin. I'm the Wild Earth Guardians Climate and Energy Program Colorado attorney. Thank you for taking my comment. I just wanted to urge you to quickly address the financial assurances rulemaking to accomplish the significant changes contemplated by SB 181 as quickly as thoroughly and possible. The current minimal blanket bonding allowed under the commission rules is inadequate and has left Colorado facing over $7 billion in unfunded asset retirement obligations, according to last year's report by Contractor. And I'll share that with you if you'll allow me. This is not only potential financial crisis for the state, but it creates a significant potential threat to public health, safety, and welfare should the state suddenly find itself financially responsible for an explosion in the number of orphan wells due to a downturn in the industry or other similar event. This rulemaking should prioritize first and foremost securing adequate financial assurances, enough to cover all of the existing and potential AROs that are guaranteed by a secure financial instrument such as an insurance policy or cash. The rulemaking ideally will include a method of covering the AROs and orphaned and near orphaned facilities, and will incentivize early retirement of assets, or at the very least discourage mothballing and holding ancient and unfair leases by production through the use of dirty stripper wells. I would also like to ask the commission to do more to evaluate facilities that have been the subject of extensive public complaint. Some facilities that were permitted before this year are just simply inappropriate. Often we see these facilities were forced into disproportionately impacted communities where they have emitted high levels of toxic pollution and created a number of nuisance impact. I believe the commission has the ability and the obligation to reevaluate these operations. Finally, I would just like to comment that the changes to the notification process and public access to information from the commission is just abominable. The link to request updates of rulemaking hearings is broken. I have not received any notice of weekly hearings, even though I followed the instructions and received confirmation that I would. I received notice of hearing applications, which are a jumble of non-information. For example, I received this notice. Docket 201-000-251, operator name, COGCC enforcement staff / AAGS operator ID, submitted the date and a time, and that was it. Clicking on the link pulled up a website which was similarly not user-friendly. By manually searching for the docket number, I was able to see that it's an order finding violation against Bison Oil and Gas for violating Rule 1002F, Stormwater and Erosion Control. Meaningful public participation relies on the public having access to this information, and I urge you to improve your public notice and the user friendliness of your website so that it's actually friendly to the public. Thank you so much, and if you'll allow me, I'll just put links to that carbon tracker report and a second one on the moral hazard of blanket bonding for your information in the text comments.
Great, thank you, Ms. Merlin. We'll be able to access those documents if you put them in the comment place, and then we will take a look at that. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. That concludes public comment. Again, for everyone in the public, we encourage public comment. We're holding public comment at each of our meetings. We are requesting folks sign up ahead of time so that we're able to accommodate public comment via Zoom. Generally, we ask you to sign up by noon the day before the public comment. So with that in mind, thanks again for taking time out of your day to address us. I've taken some notes around some of the themes and topics that I've heard this morning, and we'll pledge to take a look into some of these things that people have asked us about. With that, we are to the staff presentation on financial assurances. So I would turn this.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I was just, sorry, I was looking.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering if we could get an update next week of what's going on in Erie based on some of the public comment about natural gas unloading. Sorry, I'd be curious to know what folks have been observing and what staff knows about what's happening there, and if it is unusual that it's all happening kind of at the same time, and how folks are getting noticed. I would just be curious to learn a little bit more if that's appropriate, and if staff has some information for next week.
Director Murphy?
Sure, we can accommodate that. We have been in contact with Erie for a couple of weeks now, and I've been working closely with them, and COGCC will be participating in a town hall hosted by Erie tomorrow. So I think that's probably good for everybody to hear.
And Mr. Chair, if I could follow up on that.
Yeah, Commissioner Hackett.
Yeah, just wanted to, I'll go ahead and paste in the chats here. Not sure if any of the commenters are familiar with CDPHE's Oil and Gas Health Program, or one of the commenters mentioned it, but just encouraging folks to, if they do have health-based complaints about anything that's going on in Erie or elsewhere that they think might be attributed to oil and gas, please send them to the website that I'm posting right now in the chats. So thank you.
So would encourage everyone to check out the chat. There's references to a bunch of different things, including the CDPHE health reporting mechanism. So thank you, Commissioner Hackett, for that. Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am not sure if this is the appropriate time, but I did just want to ask if we could get some clarification on the jurisdictional issues that were raised by Mr. Bove about the water pumping and whether that is considered an oil and gas operation or not, and kind of how that fits in with our statute. I don't know if that's something that AG Davenport or AG Minor could address now, or if we can just get some clarification on that maybe next week.
I think it might be more productive to give staff a chance to collect their thoughts on it and report back to us next week. AG Davenport, you are unmuted. Did you want to weigh in on here?
I'm just unmuting to see if anything was required of me. If it's preferable to let staff get their thoughts together, et cetera, of course, that's fine with me.
Okay, let's do that. And I'm seeing in the chat that perhaps only us panelists can see stuff within the chat. So Commissioner Hackett, you were trying to get something out to the world at large. If you could direct folks to wherever it is on your website for that, then folks can have access to that.
Sure, and I think I also posted that to the entire chat as well.
Oh, okay, great. Hearings Manager Thomas is on it.
And for folks who are just listening in, that is colorado.gov/OG-health. colorado.gov/OG-health.
Great. Any other questions from commissioners surrounding public comment? All right, seeing none, Director Murphy, I believe we're going to turn to you and your staff for an update on sort of current state of financial assurances.
Thank you, Chair. And I would ask Mr. Thomas to bring Jane in to in as a panelist, please. Forgive our slightly disjointed presentation. I'm going to start off and then hand it to Ms. Stanzik, and then she will hand it back to me. I'm going to work on sharing. Oops. And Mr. Thomas, can you enable screen sharing from me and also from Ms. Stanzik?
Yes, Ms. Murphy, I'm trying to enable the screen sharing. I know that I'm operating for Ms. Stanzik. So would you direct me on how to do that on a Zoom? I apologize.
That's even more complicated. If I did send you my presentation, Mr. Thomas, if you just want to queue it up.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, great.
Apologies for the delay on this.
Yes, we're all learning together. And we will compile both Ms. Stanzik and I's presentation and get that posted for folks after the presentation itself. So again, we're here to talk about financial assurance overview. Next slide, please. Where I want to start is kind of a recap of two important, I think, guiding documents, which are first Senate Bill 19-181 and also Executive Order 2018-012. I will then hand it over to Ms. Stanzik to go through the overview of the current financial assurance status. She will hand it back to me to give a quick overview of the Orphan Well program and budget and how those pieces, in my mind, overlap with financial assurance. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about additional resources. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, I want to remind everybody about the language in Senate Bill 19-181, which specifically directs a rulemaking on financial assurance, and that the rulemaking itself must consider increasing financial assurance for inactive wells and for wells transferred to a new owner, requiring a financial assurance account tied to a well in the event of a transfer of ownership, and creating a pool fund to address orphan wells for which no owner, operator, or responsible party is capable of covering the cost of plugging, reclamation, and remediation. So that to me is kind of the founding principle that will be guiding our direction to conduct a financial assurance as rulemaking, is considering those three pieces, as well as work that's already been conducted and any work that may come forward from staff, from stakeholders. Next slide, please. I think it's also important to note that 181 builds upon work that this commission started and that was enhanced, I guess, if you will, via an executive order in 2018, as well as a change in COGCC's budgeting for orphan wells. So again, in I think late June 2018, Executive Order 2018-012 was signed by Governor Hickenlooper. Next slide, please. And it provided very specific directions to the commission about things to do around both the Orphan Well program, COGCC's budget, and also COGCC's financial assurance. The first piece of this is the Orphan Well program was directed to, for the first time, prioritize all Orphan Well projects identified throughout the state. And then also with the overarching goal that the high and medium priority sites will be plugged or reclaimed within 5 years. To help accomplish that objective, the executive order created a couple of deliverable items. One was to create a priority list by August 1st of 2018, which was completed, and then to prepare annual updates to that priority list by July 1 of every subsequent year, and also to prepare an annual report on progress towards the goals by September 1st every year. COGCC has continued to perform and prepare those reports. A second component of the executive order was that COGCC would adjust its revenues to fund the $5 million appropriation provided by the General Assembly for fiscal year 18-19, and which has continued to date. And it's important to note that in that appropriation, that line item, it increased COGCC's funding for orphan wells from $445,000 annually to $5 million. It's a significant jump. I mean, it's an order of magnitude bigger for a program in a single year. And so we spent most of fiscal year 18 and 19, building the program, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, and have now gotten up to speed with spending. The third component in my mind of Executive Order 2018-012 as it relates to financial assurance is a directive to convene a financial assurances technical work group that would prepare a report to be finalized by December 1st of 2018, and that report was finalized and is available on our website, and also to conduct a financial assurances rulemaking by September 1st, 2019. Given the directive of Senate Bill 181, the rulemaking was delayed to accommodate the high priority rulemakings required by 181, but now we're stepping back in and conducting that financial assurance rulemaking. So that to me is some of the big picture background, and I do want to highlight that there are kind of three interrelated pieces around financial assurance. One is the fundamental component of financial assurance, and we will need to be thinking about what purpose it serves, what role it serves. A second piece of that is how does financial assurance interrelate? How does financial assurance interrelate with COGCC's budget? And then how does the budget and the Orphan Well program interrelate with those other two pieces? So with that, I would like to hand it over to Ms. Stanzik to cover the current status of financial assurance. And then I'll jump back on and talk about Orphan Wells and where we go next. So with that, Ms. Stanzik.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Jane Stanzik, and I manage the Permitting and Technical Services Group. Hearings Manager Thomas, are you going to drive my slides, please?
Yes, sorry, I'm pulling this one up as you speak. Apologies.
Thank you. That's fine. Thank you. So the Oil and Gas Conservation Act requires financial assurance for oil and gas operations in our state. The 100 series rules provide this definition of financial assurance. For simplicity and out of habit, in this presentation, I will use the word bond and bonding in place of financial assurance. Next slide, please. Financial assurance is addressed in the 700 series rules. The rules require 7 types of bonds that cover specific oil and gas operations and/or facilities. A subsection of the 700 series rules is dedicated to each specific bond type, prescribing the details of the coverage and the dollar amounts. As financial assurance is a guarantee for an operator's performance of regulatory obligations, some of the subsections also cite the rules that define those obligations. Today, I will provide overviews of each bond type, some other provisions of the 700 series rules, staff's procedure for receiving and processing operators' financial assurance, and finally, some financial assurance data. Next slide, please. An operator must have a surface owner protection bond. This is often called the surface bond, when the surface owner is not a leased mineral owner and has not entered into a surface use agreement with the operator. When an operator files a permit application under these circumstances, we say they are bonding on to drill the well. The protection for the surface owner is for unreasonable crop loss or land damage. It is not for the use of their land. That would only happen through a surface use agreement. A claim against such a bond is filed by the surface owner. The commission order will require the operator to remediate and correct any loss or damage and to provide a monetary award for any loss or damage that cannot be remediated or corrected. The monetary award is not limited to these bond amounts. Like several other bond types, the rules for the surface bond provide operators the choice between individual bond options and a statewide blanket bond option. The OGLA and permitting staff verify the operator has the appropriate bonding during their review of Form 2As and Form 2s. Next slide, please. An operator must have a centralized E&P waste facility bond prior to constructing such a facility. This protects the state from bearing the cost of reclamation, closure, and abandonment of a facility as required by the 900 series rules. It is an individual bond. The amount is equal to the estimated cost to properly reclaim, close, and abandon the proposed facility. Environmental staff coordinates with the financial assurance staff during their review of the Form 28. Next slide, please. An operator or seismic contractor must have a seismic operations bond prior to conducting a seismic survey. This bond covers the cost to plug and abandon the shot holes and to reclaim the surface after the survey. It is a $25,000 statewide blanket bond. Permitting staff verifies the operator or contractor has the appropriate bonding in place during their review of the Form 20. Next slide, please. Prior to drilling a well, an operator must have a soil protection and plugging and abandonment bond. Though this bond is referred to as the plugging bond, the coverage includes the protection of the topsoil and the reclamation of the site. Coverage of the site means that plugging bonds cover wells and locations and related facilities such as crude oil transfer lines, pits, and tank batteries. Operators have two options for individual bonds based on the depth of the well. They also have options for a blanket bond that is increased for more than 100 wells. The OGLA or permitting staff verify an operator has the appropriate bonding during their review of Form 2As and Form 2s. The engineering staff verifies an operator has the appropriate bonding during their review of a Form 44 for crude oil transfer line registration. And the environmental staff verifies an operator has appropriate bonding during their review of a Form 15 for a pit. Next slide, please. The 100 series rules definition of inactive wells generally identifies wells that have not generated any revenue for 6 months to a year. According to Rule 707, an operator has excess inactive wells if the current amount of their plugging bond is less than the amount necessary to individually bond each of their inactive wells. In this example, A is the amount of the operator's current plugging bond. The determination of excess inactive wells requires some calculations. The number of shallow inactive wells is multiplied by $10,000. The number of deep inactive wells is multiplied by $20,000. Those amounts are then combined. In this example, that's B plus C equals D. If the combined total D is greater than the operator's current plugging bond, A, the operator has excess inactive wells. An operator with excess inactive wells is required to increase the amount of their plugging bond to equal the total required to individually bond each of their inactive wells. Some operators self-audit their inactive well counts and voluntarily submit additional bonding when needed. The COGCC Financial Assurance Group also conducts audits of operators' compliance with Rule 707. When necessary, staff requests additional bonding, and they pursue enforcement if the operator does not promptly respond to their request. Next slide, please. An operator must have a bond for gas gathering, gas processing, or underground gas storage facility upon the registration of that facility. The bond covers any environmental impacts from the system or facility. There's an individual bond option of $5,000 for relatively small facilities processing less than 5 million cubic feet of gas a day. For larger facilities or for multiple facilities, an operator provides a $50,000 statewide blanket bond. Engineering staff verifies the operator has the appropriate bonding during their review of the Form 12 to register the facility. Next slide, please. An operator must have a produced water transfer system bond upon registration of that system. This bond covers any environmental impacts from the system. There's an individual bond option of $5,000 for a small facility transferring less than 7,000 barrels a day. For large facilities or multiple facilities, the operator will provide a $50,000 statewide blanket bond. Engineering staff verifies the operator has appropriate bonding during their review of a Form 44 to register a produced water transfer system. Next slide, please. An operator must have a bond for the surface facilities for a Class 2 commercial underground injection control well prior to construction. This bond covers any environmental impact from these surface facilities. Each facility requires an individual $50,000 bond. The UIC staff verifies the operator has the appropriate bonding during their review of the Form 31 and the Form 33. The UIC well itself is covered by the operator's plugging bond. Next slide, please. Those were the 7 types of bonds. I'd like to point out some other provisions of the 700 series rules. Rule 702 allows the director to request that the commission order additional bonding from an operator under special circumstances, including noncompliance, when the director believes the operator may not fulfill their regulatory obligations. Rule 708 requires operators to maintain $1 million of general liability insurance for property damage and bodily injury. Rule 709 addresses the release of an operator's bonds following completion of all regulatory obligations or the replacement of the operator's bonds by those of a successor in interest. Rule 709 also provides for the Commission's foreclosure of an operator's financial assurance. Next slide, please. This is a very brief outline of staff's procedure for processing an operator's financial assurance. Before financial assurance can be accepted and processed, the operator must be registered and have provided a certificate of their general liability insurance. The 3 most common instruments for bonding are cash, certificates of deposit, and surety or insurance policies. All are submitted with a Form 3. Staff verifies the information for each type that is critical to ensure the funds will remain available to the Commission should the operator fail to perform their obligations. The operator indicates the type of bond, plugging, seismic, etc., on the Form 3. Staff assigns a unique surety ID and enters the bond type, amount, and other relevant data in the database. The bond information for each operator is available on our website. Next slide, please. This slide and chart show the current total dollar amounts for each of the 7 types of bonds. It illustrates that plugging bonds, including the excess inactive well bonding, represents 2/3 of the total financial assurance currently held by the Commission. Next slide, please. This table provides some details of plugging bonds based on the size of operators. This uses an operator's total number of wells, that's active and inactive, to define tiers of operator size. The tiers are in the first column on the left. Moving across the table shows the number of operators in each tier, their combined plugging bonds. This includes their excess inactive well bonds, their combined total number of wells, their excess inactive bonding and inactive wells, and then totals of the other facilities that are covered by plugging bonds, locations, crude oil transfer lines, pits, tank batteries, and other facilities. That's all I have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for making algebra easy when it comes to figuring out inactive well bonds. I think that's the best I've heard it presented in my number of years working with and around the Commission. And Mr. Thomas, if you can queue up the rest of my slides, I'll jump in and start talking about Orphan Wells. And Elias, if you can queue down to, I think it's the 7th slide.
All right, I'm having a bit of a delay. Give me one moment, please.
It's weird that it's not me having the delay this time. Perfect. We can run through it this way, Elias. That's fine. Oh. So again, I wanted to touch on a couple of things around the Orphan Well program and COGCC's related budget. So next slide, please. This is the same slide we saw before, but I highlighted 3 pieces, right? Orphan Well program, budget, and financial assurance. Because again, as I see it, these 3 topics interrelate in some ways. It's kind of like a Venn diagram where each is its own circle, but there's a place in which all 3 conversations intersect for the same conversation. So next slide, please. As some may know, I was a wildlife biology undergraduate student, and we learned a lot about dichotomous keys about how to figure out whether something is or isn't a specific type of animal. I continue to think that they're helpful. And so when we think about orphan wells, I think it's important to understand whether something is or is not an orphan, and then how is it funded. So in my mind, the first question is a location, an orphan, a site or a well orphaned? And the question really is there an operator capable of, or willing to do the work? If the answer to that is yes, this is not an orphan, it's not eligible for the Orphan Well program, and that operator remains responsible for that well or site. If the answer, however, is no, the well or site is eligible for COGCC's Orphan Well program. So then we go to the next question, which to me is how do we pay for the plugging, reclamation, remediation associated with that well or site? The question there is there available financial assurance associated with the well or site? If it's yes, we spend the financial assurance first, right? And to be clear, when we're spending financial assurance, these funds are non-appropriated spending for COGCC. So they do not appear in our long bill, and that will be important shortly. If the answer to the question of is there available financial assurance or enough financial assurance is no, the project or the plugging and the reclamation, the remediation is funded through COGCC's Orphan Well program line item as part of COGCC's budget process. So next slide, if we look at this visually, And this slide should look familiar. Jarrett Ellis, our budget manager, presented it at a recent commission hearing talking about COGCC's funding sources. So as we think about the funnel, COGCC is funded by fees and taxes associated with oil and gas production. We are not funded by any general fund. And so as we look at our revenues, the cone is what our revenues are, and then the legislature through the long bill tells us how much we're authorized to spend. Again, when we talk about financial assurance bond claims, whether it's from a cash bond or a surety or a different instrument that Ms. Stanzik outlined, they are non-appropriated funds and are separate from what appears in our long bill. So next slide, please. When we get into COGCC's actual budget structure, this is what the long bill and the General Assembly has told us we are authorized to spend in the current fiscal year. So for example, our Orphan Well program, we are authorized to spend a new $3.85 million, which, and this gets really complicated really quickly, and it's a topic for a separate conversation. We have 2-year spending authority for that. So we actually have multiple fiscal years that stack up, and it's a long story short. We have the authority to spend approximately $5 million a year every year on Orphan Wells because of that 2-year spending authority. So again, as we're thinking about these different pieces, we have financial assurance, which is not subject to COGCC's typical budget process through the long bill, and our revenue stream. And we look to those funds first when we're talking about a location that has been orphaned. And it's only if there is not enough or none, no financial assurance does it come into COGCC's Orphan Well program and is spent out of COGCC's revenues, which again are funded by severance taxes and mill levy primarily. Next slide, please. So getting into our spending on Orphan Wells, if you look at this graph, you'll see we spent about $500,000 in 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018. And again, this is by fiscal year, not by calendar year. We see, I put a purple arrow in about where the 2018-012 executive order became into effect, and also when the General Assembly appropriated to COGCC funding of up to $5 million annually for the Orphan Well program. And so that's the big jump between fiscal year 2018 spending and fiscal year 2019 spending. For COGCC's Orphan Well program, how we've run it internally, prior to fiscal year 2018, it was spread across or decentralized throughout multiple work units. Then Director Lepore worked closely with Dave Andrews on our team, who's now our engineering manager, to centralize that process so that we could start addressing it as its own work unit in that 17-18 timeframe. And then again in fiscal year 18, or at the conclusion of fiscal year 18, all of a sudden the program received a lot of attention and funding, and we had to ramp up from $500,000 spending a year to $5 million a year and figure out a way to track it and do it in an organized fashion. I'm really proud of the work that has gone into this space. We've built a very good team, and I think we're starting to see really great outcomes from it. And you'll see that, again, that spending jumping up from 18 to 19 and then 19 to 20 pretty significantly. Next slide, please. Kind of highlight the highlight reel, and of course these slides are really pretty because Dave Andrews put them together, not because I'm never quite that organized. So the accomplishments coming out of fiscal year 2019-2020, we met all of the reporting requirements. We have continued to bid larger, more diverse jobs to meet the new budget increases, and also last fiscal year was the first year we were fully staffed on the Orphan Well team. Unfortunately, through attrition and some other things, we are not fully staffed, but we're continuing to process a great deal of work for the state in the Orphan Well program. Next slide, please. In 19 and 20, we performed work on 103 different orphan sites. We hired 45 different contractors, and we processed 141 invoices. When I'm talking about expenditures in that same fiscal year, we spent approximately $4.7 million in fiscal year 1920. Approximately $500,000 of that was bond or financial assurance spending, and $4.2 million was from COGCC revenues. And associated with the different orphan sites, we performed about 185 different tasks. When you think about, was it a plugging site? What did we need to remove equipment? There are a number of different components, and each of those components are itemized in that orphan well priority list that staff is continuing to update annually, and that drives our workflow as it relates to orphan wells. Next slide, please. So again, we can look across the actual wells plugged by fiscal year. We're obviously continuing to make progress, and that's good work. And it's important to keep in mind when we talk about orphan wells and sites, I've been fairly precise about using both terms because they're different. Not every site has a well associated with it, or not every orphan site has a well. And some sites may have more than one well. And so I think in the vernacular, we often talk about orphan wells as inclusive of sites, but from our workflow, those are different pieces. Wells need plugs, sites need reclaimed, and some orphan wells or sites may need environmental remediation. But those are the three components that build out what the workflow is. Next slide, please. And so now starting to look at the backlog again, we can see that big transition between 2016, fiscal year 2016 to fiscal year 2018 represented COGCC centralizing all of its information about orphan projects, and then in transitioning between fiscal year 17 to 19 is building out the program in conformity with the executive order, the prioritization of orphan well sites, and how workflow is going to move through, as well as how is spending going to, how is spending changed. Next slide, please. This is a slide that we presented during the recent joint budget committee hearing that has some updates on where we are for the orphan well program through halfway through fiscal year 2021. As you can see, I think we are on pace to spend appropriately. I think we're around $3.5 million in spending exclusive of bonds. And then also we are on track to plug about 38 wells. And again, what that annual goal is driven by the metrics from the 2018 executive order and the priority list that came out of it. Our July 1, 2020 report prioritized 215 orphan well sites and 400 orphan wells and 454 orphan sites. And again, those wells, the 215 wells are associated with a site, but not every site has a well. Next slide, please. When we talk about orphan well spending, this is an excerpt from our fiscal year 1920 annual report about the orphan well program. You can see the individual project listed, as well as whether there was a bond associated, or bond or financial assurance associated with it, and the amount, and then whether it was enough or not to cover the cost of remediation, plugging, remediation, or reclamation. There's also a third column that you can see that for all of these locations does not have any spending out of it, the EMGY, that's the emergency spending. So for example, if a orphan well was identified that was creating a risk that needed to be addressed immediately and couldn't wait to work through the orphan well process, we would spend out of COGCC's emergency line item. None of these projects required that. And so then that fourth column of numbers is the total actual expenditures expended per project in the fiscal year. Another thing to keep in mind is that although plugging a well can happen fairly quickly, completing reclamation is a multi-year project. And so some of these projects may have completed the surface work, but they are continuing to be monitored by our program and are not fully complete or fully released yet. So there's an important temporal aspect about many of these projects. Next slide, please. I think it's important to note that this year we launched an Orphan Well program website that is dedicated to our Orphan Well program. A little bit redundant. The link is on the slide, and we will be making both my slides and Ms. Danzig's slides available after the hearing today for folks who are interested. There is a snapshot on this slide that shows the current backlog. We have 505 sites with work planned or in progress, and we have 199 wells remaining to plug on those sites. The website itself includes, frequently asked questions, background, annual report, a map of orphan wells, the snapshot of the backlog, expenditures, and examples of successful projects. And I think it's good to also keep in mind as we're talking about financial assurance, budget, and Orphan Wells, the scale of wells in Colorado. We have 199 wells on our Orphan well list, and there are approximately 51,000 wells in the state. Over the course of the last 3 years, operators have plugged on average 2,000 wells a year. When I started with the commission, there were approximately 57,000 wells. In Colorado, we are down to below 51,000 today, largely because of the work that operators are performing. Next slide, please. And so now I want to transition away from the Orphan Well program and talk a little bit more about additional informational resources that are available to commissioners and stakeholders that I think are informative documents for us to consider as we think about how to recast COGCC's financial assurance rules in compliance with both the executive order from 2018 as well as the legislation, Senate Bill 19181 from 2019. There are 3 documents that I'm going to talk about today at a very, very high level. There's a financial assurance technical work group. It has a very ugly acronym that was completed on December 1st of 2018. It was again a result of the executive order from 2018, a directive. In 2019, the State Oil and Gas Regulatory Exchange, the Exchange, also known as the Exchange, conducted a peer assessment review of COGCC's idle well requirements. And then the third piece of information that I think is helpful, a helpful guidepost, is the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission's 2016 State Financial Assurance Requirements Report. Next slide, please. So again, the Financial Assurances Technical Work Group met through the fall of 2018 and prepared a report that made some key recommendations around increasing bonding, addressing the Form 10 transfer process, creating a plugging, remediation, and reclamation fund, and considering increases to existing bonding amounts. Those recommendations are detailed more substantively in the document. The work group report also talked about the existing financial assurance rules and challenges. I think today we heard a very thoughtful summary of the existing financial assurance rules from Ms. Stanzik. And then next slide, please. The Financial Assurance Technical Work Group also went through a number of different topics that were discussed for different financial assurance structures or considerations. Again, some risk-based models were explored, pooled bonding or financial assurance was explored, a discussion about sinking funds and per well blanket bonding. These are going to be terms that I think we all need to become familiar with as we're talking through financial assurance and what the right policy outcomes should be for the state of Colorado. I don't want to get into these specific topics in great detail today because I'm afraid I'll transition from an educational space to an advocacy space. I'm very interested and engaged on this topic and looking forward to the ongoing consideration by the Commission of Financial Assurance. Next slide, please. In addition, a second document that I think will be very helpful for folks as they're exploring this issue with us is the Exchange's 2019 idle well assessment. The Exchange is a consortium of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission and the Groundwater Protection Council. They came together to form the Exchange, and then the Exchange functions to allow state regulators to request peer review of their rules. So for Colorado, in 2017, COGCC requested review of 4 subsets of its rules. Idle well was one of them, flow lines was one of them, wellbore integrity and flaring. And if you will recall, 3 of those topics have been addressed in great detail at this point in time, leaving only kind of the idle well assessment. The oil and gas regulators from Alabama, Alaska, and Arkansas reviewed COGCC's idle well requirements. And I think it's important To know that idle well is not a term that appears in COGCC's rules, but for purposes of the assessment, it was defined as any well that was shut in, temporarily abandoned, suspended, or idle for any other reason and not properly plugged in and abandoned to the requirements of the state. And it may seem odd that I'm talking about idle wells right now in the context of both orphan wells and financial assurance, but two of the recommendations really specifically related to financial assurance and idle well fees. And so I think it will be important to consider the recommendations and the policy issues identified in that document as it relates to idle wells and whether that's something that the Commission wants to consider in its formulation of the financial assurance rules. Next slide, please. And this is the third document, and I promise you I'm very close to the end. The Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission in 2016 prepared a report of financial assurance requirements across 29 oil and gas regulatory agencies in the United States. I picked on Oklahoma and took a quick screenshot of theirs to show what is really in the report in a state-by-state way. And Colorado's requirements are in there as well. And the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission is a quasi-governmental agency in which a number of oil and gas regulators have come together and can share ideas. It's been an incredible resource for Colorado for a long time, and in part because it provides these types of information about statewide snapshots of what regulatory requirements are. So if we want to look for other sources of information or how other states do it, this report, though a bit out of date, provides a lot of information about what other states are doing. And with that, next slide, please. I have been working with our web team, or our IT team, to create a new web page. Again, in the Senate Bill 19181 green header, if you click that, and then within it, if you hover over the rulemakings, there will be a financial assurances rulemaking page. I think it should be live later today, maybe tomorrow. And on that page, we are going to provide these three documents as a resource. Again, I think that they're a good way to frame a number of the issues and to get up to speed on a number of the questions and the vernacular that we're all going to be using in the coming months. And with that, next slide, I will stop talking and hopefully be available. Both Jane and I are available for questions. If there are specific questions we can't get answered today, we'll get the answer and get that back to the commissioners next Wednesday.
So thank you, Director Murphy. Thank you, Ms. Danzig, for the oversight. Very helpful as Commission starts to dig into financial assurances. For our stakeholders who are with us today, there's 81 of you or thereabouts. Just as a way of sort of, we had asked staff to present sort of this background information so that we could get a sense of sort of current state, as well as start to get, as Director Murphy mentioned, develop up a financial assurances website so that our stakeholders can acquaint themselves with the documents that our staff has looked into and that the commissioners are looking into as well. So that's where we're at now. At this point, we have a time for questions to staff from commissioners about the points that were made or anything around the financial assurances information we received. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple questions to clear up some of the numbers on the PowerPoint. The first one is there was a number of kind of the current state with regard to sites and wells, 505 current sites in the orphan sites and 199 orphan wells. And there was a note about some of those sites may have already, they may be underway, right, in terms of that reclamation. And I'm curious if we could separate that number out to what hasn't been touched yet and what's actually underway, so you can kind of pair that up with the 199 wells.
I will work on that.
Thank you. My next question is, how much does it cost the state on average, or do we have those numbers for at least 2020, for how much it costs for an average? And I know there's a spectrum there, but an average for site, for cleaning up an orphan site and for plugging or cleaning up an orphan well?
It's a good question, Commissioner. And we have continued to use the estimate of $82,000 for a one well site that was part of that was included in the executive order in 2018. That seems to be a decent ballpark. Again, because we have like multi-year projects, it can be hard to get a really good estimate because again, some of those projects are underway. So that continues to be our estimate.
I'm sorry, so the 82,000 is for a single well, reclamation or plugging, whatever is entailed in that. Yes. Usually a plugging and some reclamation around it. You know, and I want to get to the sites part of it because it seems like the site cleanup seems a lot more expensive and a lot more. There's a lot more variance in those potential costs for the sites, and so I'm curious for those site costs, how we can quantify that.
So I think the 82,000 to me includes reclamation at a fairly simple site. And then I think the range that we had was somewhere in the order of $200,000. I'm trying to pull the executive order because I haven't committed that to memory yet.
But you think 200,000 may be a ballpark, and is that like a per acre fee or just like a per pad fee? I'm using the word fee incorrectly there. I know that. Okay.
Yeah, per site.
Okay. And I think those were some clarifying questions that I had for now, and I can pass it along to other commissioners. Thank you, Director Murphy.
Sorry, I was looking down. Commissioner Messner, Commissioner Nanjapa. I'm not sure who was first.
Go ahead, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. How frequent would you say is the blanket bond option chosen by operators versus the per well option?
I think most operators have a blanket bond that is then complemented by their excess and active wells.
Okay, and then a follow-up, given those costs that you were just elaborating on for Commissioner Gonzalez, when you are dealing with an orphan well and especially the site reclamation, what would you say are the, for lack of a better word, the corners that end up getting cut because you don't have enough funds for, a full site reclamation? Or because you have other orphan sites that you need to address as well?
I don't think we cut corners, Commissioner Nanjapa. I think we complete plugging, remediation, and reclamation work on sites and move through them appropriately to protect public health, safety, welfare of the environment before we release. We would consider those orphan well sites fully released, if you will. And so that's why we do continue to monitor remediation or reclamation projects over the course of years. And so the backlog represents work that we haven't gotten to yet.
Follow-up, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify there. So, in saying corners cut, I'm meaning that, with a limited budget and a certain number of orphan wells you're trying to address, do you kind of put on hold certain activities? Is that sort of the backlog you're referring to because you can't do everything in 1 year? And so you kind of push some other piece of that whole site reclamation to the next year or so on. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yes, so in 2018, one of the directives was to create a priority list. And in that priority list, rank an orphaned site as high, medium, or low in terms of what is the priority for us to complete work at that location. The executive order directed us to complete all high and medium prioritized projects in a 5-year time period, and we're continuing to work on that. And so Dave's team, the Orphan Well team reprioritizes, conducts that priority list every year with new locations that are added. And so that guides our workflow. That being said, high priority or our highest priority, if there wasn't something that even exceeded the high priority, that emergency line item, that's the first thing that we would deal with. and then high priority and medium priority. And the way that we're looking at that workflow is, can we chunk it together into the same request for proposal to put out to bid in a way that, you know, provides some economies of scale or work in a similar area. So we're looking at these projects in total across the state in a way to get them done in accordance with the executive order, in accordance with our budget, and in accordance with what we perceive their risk or lack of risk to be to the state. And so that's, again, I think that is guiding our work, and getting to the lowest priority ones is not something that we've been able to achieve with budget and also personnel constraints. So.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for that presentation. I thought that was really well done and broad, and accomplished a lot of information. So, you know, I'll continue to go back to those slides and review, and I may have more questions after I fully absorb the information. I did have just a couple of follow-ups to some of the questions that were already asked, which were similar to some of the questions that I had. So, and one of them was that average price or the average cost, you know, per orphaned well, and understanding the backlog and the metrics that are associated with that. And I think it is good to have some sort of breakdown, like Commissioner Gonzalez had indicated, and I think that's helpful for me to get my head around kind of what the scene is. But then I don't know, is there a metric, you know, to take your kind of wildlife metaphor a little bit? So we've got the orphan wells, and those are the endangered species, but do we have like a metric for the candidate species, right? So the ones that are potentially threatened to be orphaned while they're not yet, they have some of the characteristics that may make them, you know, potential candidates for being an orphan well in the future, near future?
Commissioner Mender, that's been what I would say is the crystal ball question that I think that we have consistently been asked as an agency for at least 6 of the last years, and is also the most difficult for me to answer, because we don't have eyes into the financials and what makes a well have ongoing utility. I think that if you look through the SOGR, or actually not the SOGR, sorry, the IOGCC annual requirements report and the SOGR report, actually there is a discussion of the role of idle wells in creating risk or not to the state, and how different states address that perception of risk. That to me is a lot of what the financial assurance recommendations in the idle well report are about, and what states like Arkansas and others have dealt with in different ways in terms of requiring operators to come forward and demonstrate utility or bond. And that's the purpose of our inactive well bonding requirements, is that if a well is inactive, the principle to me is if a well is inactive, there is not a revenue stream for it, and that creates concern. And so that anyway, I don't have
Does
that.
production play into that at all? Like the volume of production?
I intuitively I would say yes, right? Production is the revenue stream, but I don't. Operators could capitalize themselves in different ways, could be planning for plugging in different ways, and so that's where it very quickly moves away from the data that I have and can analyze into data that we don't have and business judgments, and that to me is the art of the financial assurance rulemaking, is understanding those components.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I have one other question if I could.
Yes.
So, and this is a stupid question, so I apologize in advance, but I mean, I'm trying to fully understand the blanket bond concept, right? So the individual well bonding, I understand, you know, and how you would access that, but you've got a blanket bond, and let's say the blanket bond statewide is 50,000. And if I remember the slide, which I don't, maybe that's for 100 wells. So, and let's assume that one well, you know, potentially could be 82,000. And so you're going to go access that blanket bond, but they have all these other wells. I mean, how does that dynamic work as far as if you're needing to utilize that blanket bond, how do they rebond themselves for the rest of the wells?
So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. If there is no such thing as an operator that gives us a bond and then gets to keep doing business.
Okay.
Right. If you've given up your bond, to me, you've given up your opportunity to operate in the state of Colorado. You've lost your Form 1. That's a one way in my mind. And so the purpose of those bonds is to provide assurance in the case that somebody is not able to complete their obligations in accordance with the Act and rules. So once we tap that blanket bond, we would apply it to the highest priority sites in our estimation. And then any remaining obligations that were not funded by the financial assurance held by that operator would then flow into the Orphan Well program and would be funded by COGCC's revenues.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think Commissioner Messner and I are, I have similar questions to his. So, sorry. So if going back to the blanket, how a blanket bond works, if I have more than 99 wells, I have a blanket bond of $100,000. So I could have 100 wells and my bond only covers, $100,000. So if I go belly up, the state only has $100,000 to take care of up to more than 100, potentially 100 plus wells to address.
Correct, as long as all of those wells are active and the inactive well bonding hasn't kicked in.
So how did we come up with the $60,000 blanket bond for less than 99 wells and $100,000 for more than 100 wells?
That is a wonderful question, and I would have to go dig through the documents associated with our last financial assurance rulemaking to assess what the decision was and how it was calculated. And I think that sounds like an excellent project for AAG minor. So.
Okay.
Bingo.
And so when we are defining inactive wells, and one of those definitions is it hasn't produced for more than a year, how long are you allowed to stay on that list? How long are you allowed to say I'm inactive? So after 1 year, now I'm inactive for 2 years, now I'm inactive for 3 years. And this is kind of tied to Commissioner Messner's question. Is there a point at which we say you're really not inactive, you're really not producing, you're not doing anything, and something needs to be done about your well? So is there like a tipping point at which staff says you can't be on this list anymore, you either have to be active or you have to plug and abandon it?
Commissioner McGowan, we don't have any requirements that say if you've been inactive for X period of time, staff has the authority to require bonding, plugging. However, we do have mechanical integrity requirements that apply once you become inactive to verify that the wellbore continues to serve its purpose and be in compliance. And how that has played out for me occasionally as I've watched enforcement processes move through is that a well that's been inactive for a period of time and is not in compliance with the MIT or mechanical integrity testing requirements will come through the enforcement process and may end up orphaned through that enforcement process.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, please go ahead with the line question.
Do we have any sort of assessment of an operator and the percentage of inactive wells they have to their active wells, and whether or not there's some? So I get that we looked at their bonding, so they have a blanket bond plus bonds that cover inactive wells. Is there a point at which we say you have so many inactive wells compared to inactive wells that we have concerns about your viability or what's going on with your business, so to speak? So I don't know how else to ask that.
Commissioner McGowan, we don't have a regulatory requirement that addresses that ratio, if you will, of inactive to active wells. We do have is the regulatory requirement that kicks in to require additional financial assurance if you have excess inactive wells.
Why would an operator have a large number of inactive wells but still want to be drilling new wells?
I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer a question about the operator's perception on that.
Maybe that's something we can ask later on.
It is. I do want to add a little bit of color, though, if I may, which is that a number of operators who are do have active active drilling programs. Because of the regulatory requirements to require offset well evaluations and remediations and requirements, there are operators who have an active drilling regime that also have a significant number of inactive wells, and they are inactive because they have been shut in or otherwise put into an inactive status to protect wellbore integrity of the offset wells. So there are some circumstances in which you would see somebody who has a high number of inactive wells that is accommodating the current drilling program, and that's a good safety mechanism. I think that mechanism has also led to plugging the number of wells across the state of Colorado. So there are a couple of different pieces at play in that conversation, but in terms of an operator's, independent of that regulatory requirement, I can't answer your question.
So one last question, and I think I've asked this before, but I'm sorry, I don't remember the answer. Do we require some sort of, do we review on some sort of regular basis, a review of whether or not people are up to date on their financial assurance and their bonds and they're all paid up or in good standing? So like when you go to register your vehicle, you have to show that you have insurance. So there's some kind of check and balance to make sure that people, hopefully, who are driving have insurance at least 1 month out of the year when you go get your car registered and updated. Do we have some sort of regular review from operators?
Yes, and that's in addition to the individual pieces that Ms. Danzig outlined about checking for financial assurance through a permitting process or other regulatory processes.
Commissioner Nanchapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And related to the sort of this discussion on the inactive wells, is it possible to just put up the algebra slide again on the that Ms. Stanzik put together? I just, it was very helpful, but I didn't fully absorb, and I just wanted to, I have a question, but it may be answered if we could just take a quick look at that.
Hearings Manager Thomas, can you get that slide back up for us?
And then maybe while he's doing that, I did have another somewhat unrelated question, and that is that with SB 181, you know, there's the potential for creating a permit fee. And I was just curious if we could talk a little bit through about any, how that would change the way the funds are currently allocated for these different aspects, especially, of course, the Orphan Well program.
Director Murphy?
I'll take a really high level answer to that. And in that, yes, Senate Bill 181 says create permit fees that cover the direct and indirect costs of permit review. That, in my mind, and this is where it's a little bit dangerous, and hopefully Jarrett is listening very closely to what I say, that would create a different revenue stream for COGCC's budget to fund what it is authorized to spend through the long bill. And so as we think of that funnel slide that had those two sources of revenue, mill levy, or three sources of revenue, really, mill levy, severance tax, and kind of this other, we get some grant monies. When we adopt permit fees, we will add a fourth ball to that funnel, which would be the permit fees. And as we do that, we will need to balance the permit fee revenue with our other sources of revenue to make sure that we are continuing to only generate what we need and maintain the balanced budget, because nobody wants us to generate a gigantic surplus, of course. So that is a component. How it fits in will depend on the amount of the permit fees and what permits are covered. And again, that's that interesting intersection of these three conversations about financial assurance, budget, and Orphan Wells. So jumping, if that's good enough, we can jump to your question about algebra, which I probably should not answer, but I might try, who knows?
Well, thank you. No, thank you, Director Murphy. That's very helpful. I think I'm actually good now that I just had another look at the slide. It just was a little bit faster than my brain could process. So unless anybody else has a question about this, I did have another sort of follow-up related to one of my prior questions, but maybe I'll pause for a second in case anyone else.
Maybe I could jump in just as we're talking about the inactive well. Maybe I could have Director Murphy or Ms. Stanzik sort of explain to the people that are listening, because part of this is educational for us. It's also educational for our stakeholders who are going to participate in financial assurance. But explain the purpose behind the inactive well sort of, you mentioned earlier that most operators do blanket bond and then the inactive well sort of bonding. Can you explain the inactive well component to it? Why are we doing it that way? How are these numbers derived? Just sort of from a layman's perspective.
I'll take a half answer to that, Chair. And the first half is in terms of how the numbers were calculated and what the numbers are. I kind of have the same answer I had for Commissioner McGowan, is that we need to dig into what was done before my time with the commission.
That's fair.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. There is a component of is the inactive well shallow or deep, which you can see on this slide.
Mm-hmm.
And that mirrors a number of other state regulatory requirements where there is a bonding or a financial assurance requirement that is tied to the depth of the well, the length of the well bore, some of these different components. And whether that calculation relates to the true cost of plugging, to me, is a little bit of an open question. Because in my conversations, and this would be a good place to have some industry input, I think that the cost of plugging a well may not depend on the type of well, the length of well, the depth of the well. It is a hole in the ground, right? There are other components that would change costs, the caliber of the casing, for example, the amount of surface disturbance. Is it, what are your reclamation goals? Are you reclaiming to ag land, or are you reclaiming to a high desert? So those are the places where I think that there's more variability in costs. However, a number of states have chosen to pursue costs based on metrics around the well specifically. And that is a policy choice, right? And then now I feel like I've forgotten the rest of your question, but it was a very detailed answer, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And obviously that's something that we're going to dig into as we, evaluate changes or amendments to financial assurances. Is that equation still appropriate given the, what we're looking at? I guess my other thing is that, we have this additional bonding for inactive wells with this algebraic formula on how you get to that number. I'm guessing it's because we feel there's a greater concern if you've got more inactive wells, therefore we want more money up front.
Thank you. That was the second part of your question. And yes, I think that is the concern that idle wells create. And I used idle in that sentence instead of inactive to cue that's a lot of what the focus of the idle well report by the State Oil and Gas Regulatory Exchange is about, is that intersection of inactive facilities. From my perspective, an inactive or idle well is not generating revenue. And so does that create concerns? In some instances, yes. In other instances where it's been inactive to accommodate a drilling regime, maybe not. And so that kind of dovetails with some of the dialogue that I had with Commissioner McGowan. And so I think that policy objective of increasing bonding for inactive wells is one that the Commission likely will get the opportunity to explore, and can look at how other states have addressed that risk or that concern, and whether that's appropriate for Colorado or not.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Nanjapa, you can go to your next topic.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks so much for the explanations there. So I'm going back to my question about, as I put it, cutting corners, and I understand the prioritization that you're, following. Just to kind of get a little finer point on it, I'm wondering if my assumption that I want you to correct me about is that you're sort of triaging within those priorities, doing the plugging and abandoning of the actual well, any sort of, you know, immediate environmental considerations like a spill or leak or anything like that. Is there anything that tends to be sort of left for last as you kind of are figuring out how you can address as much of that as possible with respect to like the overall site remediation? You know, for example, the soils, the vegetation, that type of thing.
Director Murphy.
Thanks, Commissioner. I think the answer is no, but the staging of when that work is done will depend on the bid project itself. I mean, that's so defining the scope of each location or each site's project is what goes into that priority listing. And so if we have a well that has a well bore that's concerning for some reason, that task might be prioritized in a year over completing the reclamation or the revegetation work, depending on workload priorities and all those other things, all the other pieces. And so as the Orphan Well team is looking to put together a bid package, because we have the funding, but we bid this work out to contractors. Again, can we get a dirt mover on 2 or 3 locations that are close to each other to gain some efficiencies and costs? And so that's how the tasks get broken down differently and across different projects. But the long-term goal for all locations is to plug any wells and complete reclamation and remediation. But it is hard because those tasks can occur differently and across different years. It's not as straightforward to track as it would seem it should be.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up a little bit on that line of questions. So 2 things. One is there was an increase in funding for the Orphan Well program that was an appropriation by the General Assembly. And I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to be clear because I think there's a lot of misinformation about this, but that appropriation by the General Assembly is still money that is within the COGCC mill, right? It is not a general fund appropriation from the state of Colorado. It is an additional appropriation from the mill within COGCC, which is, you know, for lack of a better term, a fee on production, right?
You're correct, Commissioner. The General Assembly tells us how much we can spend. This is how I think about it very simply, right? And again, hearings or the budget manager, Jarrett, might punch me for it, but the General Assembly tells us what we can spend. And then it's up to us to set our revenue stream at an appropriate level to accommodate that spending. And so that's a combination of severance tax, which we receive through the Department of Natural Resources process. And then the lion's share of it is made up through the mill levy that is a fee on oil and gas production. And again, you are correct. We do not receive any general funds to conduct the work of the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission.
And so then looking at, you know, the fact that, you know, that Orphan Well program has really ramped up, particularly over the last couple of years. There's still a backlog, and just to understand kind of lay of the land today, is that backlog due to lack of funding to be able to catch up? Is it because of lack of capacity, or is it because there are more wells going into orphan status than we anticipated?
That's a very good question, Commissioner, and I'll try to take all 3 parts of it. When the General Assembly increased the appropriation for the Orphan Well program from $445,000 to $5 million with 2-year spending authority for beginning in fiscal year 19, so that'd be 2018 and into 19. It also included an increase in staff of, I think, 5 FTE, 4 or 5 in that range. And those 2 numbers line up fairly intentionally, right? We need the right number of people to spend the right number of dollars. And so even if we were given $300 million to spend on this project, if we don't have people to bid the projects out, we can't do it. And the converse is true. If we had 300 people, we couldn't do the work without the dollars. So those two numbers match up closely, and they also align with the executive order from 2018, which contemplated a 5-year program spending approximately $5 million a year. So all those metrics line up, right? And now I forgot all the other pieces of the question. I'm not doing very well today, guys.
I mean, you're nailing it. And so, I mean, the question was, is it a capacity issue? We've gained 5 FTE. But there's a certain capacity to the 5 FTE. At the same time, we've got a 2-year spending authority of the $5 million, which generates a certain amount of money, but that still may not be enough money in order to catch up from the backlog. And then the third piece of that question was, are we kind of seeing what we anticipated as far as wells that have gone into the orphan status, or are we seeing more than we anticipated, I guess?
Yes, that's the important third question. And I think that we saw a big jump in that 17, 18, 19 timeframe, and that again reflected COGCC centralizing its data. And then there's been kind of an up and down over the last couple of fiscal years, depending on the work that's been completed, where it is in that process. And so we have seen some changes in the backlog of both sites and wells. That has maintained a fairly constant number, I think, across 2 years. It's hard to pull, I mean, I'm no scientist, so Commissioner Najapa should correct me, but figuring out the trends with 2 data points is risky to me, or like it's not very informative. And so I think we need a little bit more time to see how that goes. And also the first year we had the program, we were really building it and maybe not getting as much work into the field. And so now we're kind of catching up and seeing how that goes. This is, again, like the $1 million question I get from the JBC every year, or COGCC gets from the JBC every year, is everybody is worried about bankruptcies and, the volatility in the markets, and isn't that creating a huge firestorm? And it has not yet. And again, like when I look at the metrics, we had, I think the backlog was 199 wells on COGCC's orphan well list, and industry plugged 2,000 last year. So to me, part of the conversation needs to be about how do we continue to harness industry's own work in this space. And we continue to monitor it. And if there is a giant slug of wells that comes in, or that is unexpected, we'll have to have that conversation. But it's a real-time monitoring for me. It's a little bit like projecting our budget. We watch it very closely and are very attentive to it and monitor the changes, but we haven't, I guess we haven't seen the huge groundswell of wells and orphans being added to the list in the last 2 years that some have had great concern about.
Okay, thank you very much.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Director Murphy, I've got a couple questions to kind of follow up on some of the things that have been discussed so far. The first one I want to tackle is getting into this kind of understanding the characteristics of wells that are potentially to become orphans, right? These threatened species for an analogy. How often does a well that's not classified as inactive become an orphan well?
That's a really complicated question to answer, Commissioner Gonzalez, because when wells come to us on the orphan well program, it could be because it was a well that was drilled in 1930 and nobody knew about it, and all of a sudden it comes onto the list, right? Like there was never a regulatory regime associated with that well, but it is an oil and gas well and it needs to be plugged. There are also wells that come to our orphan well program through an enforcement process where an operator is no longer able to conduct work in compliance and has either voluntarily walked away or has turned over their keys as part of the enforcement process. And so we haven't tracked that question of, was it inactive? Did it become orphaned closely? Because there's such disparate reasons why wells come onto that list.
Okay.
And the converse, sorry, I'm going to go a little bit further.
Please.
The converse of that is also true, right? Like we have gigantic numbers of wells in the DJ Basin in particular that are being put into an inactive status for any number of reasons: drilling operations, compliance with consent decrees with other federal agencies. So there's lots of reasons that things become inactive, and whether they then become orphans, it's not it hasn't been a clear correlation for me. That being said, I haven't actually like pulled the data back and done that math. So this is my fairly intuitive answer.
No, and that's really helpful. I'm trying to find that correlation if it exists, right? You know, because there's been some talk about that. So that's where my question came from. I appreciate that. My next question is about kind of this threat of bankruptcy we've talked about, and that's been part of public comment. It's been, you know, part of discussion of the legislature and amongst this group is, you know, this isn't the first downturn in the oil and gas industry, right? You know, there was 2008, there was 2013, there was, you know, what we're seeing today in 2020, 2021. And I'm curious, have we seen any of those kind of ramp ups associated with bankruptcies, orphan wells tied to downturns in oil and gas commodity prices? You're on mute.
I was so excited to answer. No, I don't know that we have tightly enough tracked data to answer that question, right? Like, we weren't really tracking orphan wells in this way in the 80s, for example. And we have seen a couple of dips in the market in my tenure here. And again, most of the wells that have been plugged by industry. And I think that there have been some smaller scale enforcement pieces that have gone through that have ended up with orphan wells in that time period. But the correlation isn't entirely clear to me.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess then another question that you may not have the answer to, again, I'm kind of really trying to quantify, you know, where we're at. This is, you know, we got a problem that we're trying to not only solve, but we're trying to figure out what the problem is and the goals of solving that problem, all in that same suite, you know, so the true, you know, kind of horse and cart type dilemma. What's the biggest batch of wells that COGCC has been stuck with, or the state has been stuck with, from an operator walking away, or from an operator going bankrupt, or for whatever reason, you know, a batch of wells may come into the orphan well program or may come into the orphan well list?
I apologize. I don't have a specific number in mind. I'll see if, fortunately, our hearings manager, Dave Andrews, is listening in, and he said about 80 is the biggest batch that we've received. I think that the other side of that question that I want to answer is kind of the more expensive side, of where we have gotten expensive remediation projects and insufficient bonding. And so those two pieces interrelate on some level.
Thank you. And then my last question doesn't have anything to do with what we've talked about, aside from clarity for future homework, is when was the last financial assurance rulemaking?
2009.
It was 2009. Thank you, Chair Robbins. Thanks, Director Murphy.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Others with questions? All right. Well, thank you, Director Murphy, for the well-run dialogue there. You did an excellent job answering questions. I know there's some questions you guys are going to go and investigate, get back to us with next week, which is great. But I think this has been a great tool for the commission and for our stakeholders as we, you know, get ready to launch into financial assurances and a rulemaking around that as instructed by SB 19-181. With that, commissioners, the next agenda item is sort of commissioner comment. We are at noon. I don't know how long commissioner comment is going to go, but we've been going at it for 3 hours. Do we want to take a quick break, or do we want to roll into commissioner comment preferences? Let's roll. Just keep rolling. Okay. That's the universal word for roll. So, okay. Well, at this point, do folks have comments that they would like to make? I see that AAG Davenport has shown up, and I might ask him to speak to us sort of briefly about initial steps around engaging a financial assurances rulemaking. I think that, you know, I think that I, for one, and you know, I've talked with Director Murphy, think that we want to do something around an informational docket and let folks kind of weigh in on a lot of the things that we've heard today. And so can you maybe help us through what that could look like keeping in mind the Administrative Procedures Act as well as Rule 529.
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, commissioners. I would like to alert you to just a few of the requirements in both the APA and our rules. The APA provision specifically that I'll be speaking about is 24.4.103 subpart 2, and it's Rule 529 in the Commission's rules. The APA requires that an agency put together a group of interested stakeholders in the course of a rulemaking. The APA is not specific that group, that representative group of stakeholders must be put together before or after the notice of rulemaking. However, Rule 529D, as in dog, is specific that prior to the notice of proposed rulemaking, the commission or director will establish a representative group of participants in the interest in the subject of the rulemaking. The APA provides a little more detail in the sense that it is intended to be a group of stakeholders that are able to give the commission views on how they may be affected positively or negatively by that rulemaking. But that's really the only guidance that the APA provides. Our rule gives the commission a lot of flexibility and discretion in how it's going to conduct those, I'll call them informational sessions. I think in my view, the purpose of the representative group of stakeholders in advance of a notice of proposed rulemaking is to give the commission information about that proposed rulemaking and the topics and various views on, as the APA states, how people may be positively or negatively affected. Again, how to conduct that exactly, there's a lot of discretion and flexibility in how the commission wants to put together that representative group, how it wants to hear from that representative group as well.
Thank you, AAG Davenport. Do any of the commissioners want to weigh in at this point on sort of next steps? Commissioner Najapa, and then Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I think in that vein of thinking about getting input and feedback from stakeholders, you know, I think we have some, and either AAG Davenport or Chair Robbins, stop me if I'm getting ahead of myself, but you know, we've been just kind of thinking a little bit about the types of things we'd like to hear from stakeholders, and just compile them into a document. Would that be appropriate to share at this point?
Yes, sorry, muted.
Okay.
At least I'm not a cat.
Give me one moment, I'm going to share my screen. So what we have up here on the screen is just it's a draft so far. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay. So it's a draft so far of questions that we have, we as commissioners have just kind of put together in this document. We will attempt to finalize it by the end of this week and get it out to everybody so that folks can look at it. But these are the types of things that we've all just been thinking about individually, or many of these I think we all sort of have questions about. And I'm just slowly scrolling through it so that everybody gets a little bit of a sense of the types of things we're thinking about. But again, we will make this available to everybody, and we may all have a few more things that we'll add to it after all the great discussion today. Anything else any other commissioners want to add?
Commissioner Gonzalez, and
Thank
I think
you.
I saw Commissioner Messner's hand as well.
You know, this is a good list, and I don't think this is complete at all, and we're going to keep on fleshing it out. And I would encourage, you know, all the operators who are listening today, you know, the questions we had today are questions that may or may not be on this list, or may or may not be, you know, even formally communicated or framed. But you get the gist of what we're thinking about as we're getting into this financial assurance rulemaking or in preparation thereof. So I'd encourage all the operators who are listening now to not limit what they want to talk to us about to what's on this list or whatever list we provide. So stating the obvious, but don't want it to go unsaid. Thank you.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I do think this is a good list of questions. I think it's certainly a start of, some of the things that I would hope would be expanded upon by stakeholders, in this pre-process, this informational process. And this is a question to the commissioners: is kind of the goal here, the idea for these particular questions to get fleshed out in written format by stakeholders and then submitted to us at some point in the future? Is it, and then how does a stakeholder determine, how is a stakeholder determined? I mean, can anyone kind of share their thoughts on this and then send it in to us? Are we going to group these into different stakeholder groups, or what are thoughts on the structure of it, I guess?
I think those are excellent points, Commissioner Messner. And I can just sort of share my thoughts about this. I think that what we do is we finish up the document, we get it posted, we allow Director Murphy to reach out to our email list of people that are interested in all things that we're doing. We invite everyone to, give people a period of time that's reasonable to get to file something with us. We may even, have a hearing officer help sort of go through this and group things as we've done in the past, and then have at one of our regular scheduled meetings or a special meeting, hear from folks, give them an opportunity to go over whatever written product they put together, but also, I would want to tend to keep it kind of informal, so that we're having a discussion with people that have individually signed, people or groups that have signed up for this initial part of our rulemaking. I think it really helps educate us and our stakeholders, and is a good initial step before we, formally move into a financial assurance rulemaking. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that. I think that's a great idea, and I do think in my opinion, the emphasis there being, an informal informational dialogue, right? So it's not the formal rulemaking. It's not, point counterpoint. It's really just sharing thoughts, getting information, allowing us to ask questions, getting a good base of information before we head into the formalities of the rulemaking. And so I think if folks are going to jump in and engage in that, I think it's important to understand that this is not the formal rulemaking, but rather is, an informal dialogue to try to generate a good baseline of information.
Commissioner McGowan. Commissioner Gonzalez would be next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Commissioner Messner with the additive of hopefully what folks are going to share with us will provide some clarity that might help drive some sort of a straw proposal for people to react to as part of the official rulemaking.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, and I want to kind of share that as one commissioner, I know that I appreciate pre-written materials. So if that's the way we end up going, and I think that could be appropriate within limits. I think data is really easy, is a lot easier to understand and to dialogue on when someone has an opportunity to digest it ahead of time. Algebra as well, although I can keep up okay. I did all right today. So anything that it's data, math, quantification driven, or just any kind of framing of ideas that could give us a head start, I don't think would be hurtful. I know that we'll probably have to put some parameters on that through our formal request for these materials, but I would look forward to those written materials ahead of time.
Other commissioners with thoughts? So I think what I'll do with the permission of the commission is work with Director Murphy in terms of, so let's all work on the doc and get that in a finalized place. And then I'll work with Director Murphy and AG Davenport to put together this proposal that we've talked about for an informational docket. And to all of our stakeholders that are listening in, there's 70 of you, as well as to the stakeholders that we'll reach out to. Please plan on looking to our website by, say, close of business this week, and we'll try to get something up on the first page there that articulates and outlines how we're going to run this informational docket. And we'll look forward to getting that information from folks and then having that informational session. Director Murphy, does that all sound okay to you?
It does, Chair. And if I may add, my team reminded me very thoughtfully that the financial assurance webpage is live. If anyone's having trouble accessing it like I have all morning, you might want to clear your cookies, which was the trick for me to actually be able to get into that site. So I continue to demonstrate a lack of IT prowess, but I'm really excited.
So clear your cache, like close out your browser and start over at COGCC, and then you can get to the newly revamped Financial Assurances webpage. Great. Anything else for the good of the cause today? I think this has been a really highly successful initial discussion around financial assurances. I want to thank staff, thank Ms. Stanzik and Director Murphy, as well as all the others that I'm sure worked on all this. Any final commissioner comments? Commissioner Hackett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had some general comments from the CDPHE perspective. And since I saved my comments for last, I'm starting to feel like that annoying kid in class who begs the teacher for homework and stands in between you all in recess. So I'll hopefully be brief and won't assign too much homework for anyone. But yeah, just wanted to say from the water world, I wanted to thank COGCC staff for participating in the Water Commission hearing on Monday, as well as the Water Quality Control Division's Groundwater Summit that followed. The hearing and the summit were related to Senate Bill 89-181, which you might recall amended the Water Quality Control Act and defined the roles and responsibilities of state agencies who have a role in protecting water quality. So Monday was a good opportunity to reconnect, hear updates from these experts and coordinate on groundwater issues. And one issue that came up, or at least during the summit, took a lot of time discussing was our agency's shared responsibility to break the chain of PFAS contamination in the environment. And just wanted to say that COGCC staff in their presentation to the commissioners, they did a great job educating the water commissioners on the mission change rules. And I'm happy to report that one of the commissioners made sure to express their gratitude for the additional water quality protections that will be realized in those rules. And the other commissioners nodded their heads in agreement enthusiastically. So kudos on that presentation. The other thing I wanted to mention, speaking of PFAS and moving from water to waste, starting at 9 a.m. on February 16th, CDPHE's Solid and Hazardous Waste Commission has a rulemaking hearing which would establish registration requirements for firefighting foams that contain PFAS. And then lastly, the only thing I wanted to highlight for air quality, at the upcoming commission hearing, the Air Commission hearing on February 19th at 9 a.m., it's currently scheduled for the Colorado Energy Office to give a briefing on the greenhouse gas emissions reduction roadmap. Also something that this commission might be interested during that Air Commission hearing. Later in the morning, our Executive Director, Jill Hunsaker-Ryan, will be seeking input from the Air Commissioners on the department's plans to establish or create a proclamation establishing racism as a public health crisis. And the agenda for that and registration is available on the Air Commission's website.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Hackett. We actually appreciate your keeping us up to speed, so you're not the school child keeping us away from recess. So thank you very much. Other last thoughts, comments from folks? All right, seeing none, I'll have a motion to go into recess. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn and go to recess and play.
And a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.